I call the member for Canning.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise today to also talk about the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights and their report on the freedom of speech in Australia, particularly as it pertains to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. And I note that this is a fraught issue with many stakeholders, with many submissions, and I acknowledge the diversity of opinion, and I think that's a very good thing. It reflects a healthy Australian society. And so the fact that we're having this debate here is also an indicator that we have a healthy, functioning democracy. There are a number of things I want to say up front, because those opposite have misconstrued many of our positions. Words like divisive and hysteria. I want to make very clear where I stand, so I'm going to lift the bonnet a bit on my thinking before I get to 18C itself. I'm not a libertarian. I'm not a libertarian, but I am a liberal, which is to say that I'm committed to freedom. Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of enterprise, a whole host of freedoms that we hold dear in this country. And of course, today we're talking about freedom of speech. And I'm going to quote John Donne, and at risk of sounding terribly heteronormative, I'm going to use the original words of his poem. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Freedom only makes sense in the context of community. We do not live in isolation from each other in this country. We have constant exchange with our neighbours. We have a mutual dependence upon each other, which is why we come together to form local, state and federal governments. That reflects our search for order and our desire to secure our collective freedoms. Government is especially important when we come together to do tasks that we can't do ourselves, especially in emergencies. So I just want to make clear that I'm not a libertarian, I'm a liberal, and I believe in limited government, I believe in the separation of power, I believe in the diffusion of power, and that's why our Westminster system, I think, is the best system of government in the world, and I'm proud that Australia has that as our system of government. But alongside those freedoms and rights come responsibilities. And as I said, we have a mutual dependence upon each other. At the heart of our democracy is the volunteer spirit. And in an ideal world, every Australian would self-regulate or self-govern. But of course, that's not true. But it does raise the question, what role does government have in our lives? Is it the supporting act or is it the main protagonist? I'm of the view that it is the supporting act. And my point about 18C is that it ultimately is symbolic of government overreach. It's government overreach interfering in the lives of individual Australians and regulating one of our most basic freedoms, which is freedom of speech. I also want to be very clear on my anthropology, my view of humankind. I believe that all people are endowed with respect and inherent worth and dignity. Whatever race, whatever ethnicity, whatever colour, whatever religion, whatever sex or sexuality, it doesn't matter. Everyone is deserving of respect because we are all endowed with inherent worth. I want to state that up front very clearly. I also believe that a healthy civic society means that government can step back out of our lives. We call these mediating institutions or pre-political institutions, and every single electorate has them. We start with the family and we work outwards to clubs, sporting clubs, Rotary clubs, surf life-saving clubs, churches, temples, mosques, schools, charities, you name it. They're in every single electorate around this country, and I believe they should be the first line of defence against discriminatory speech. They should be the first line of defence. I'd rather see them empowered rather than big government interfering in people's lives, which I think is what's been the case with the exercise of 18C. Of course, in my electorate, and I'm sure around the country, people have disengaged with civic society, so this is a task that all Australians should be engaged in to rebuild a strong civic society. So back to the Racial Discrimination Act, the topic itself, 18C. The heart of the question, what sort of a society do we want? Do we want one regulated by the state, or do we want one regulated by the citizenry? Do we want the state as the main protagonist or the supporting act? And I think, as we've seen with the QUT case, with the Bill Leak case, that 18C has allowed vexatious litigation to creep into our society, where people are being inhibited in the exercise of their freedom of speech. And we're seeing creeping political correctness across the board. We're seeing it in universities, we're seeing it in schools, and I think 18C, whilst not a lot of us, not every Australian fully understands what it means, but for a lot of people it's emblematic of that creeping state interference and political correctness. George Orwell wrote a famous essay, Politics in the English Language, and in that he argued that language and thought are intimately related. And so if we are to truly exercise freedom of conscience, we need to have the freedom to exercise our speech as well. And of course, thought corrupts language and language corrupts thought, as he famously made clear. And if we have the state regulating our speech, you also have the state regulating our thought. And I think that looks a lot like 1984, another great book by George Orwell. Now, of course, the cases that have been brought before the racial, that have been prosecuted or litigated with 18C have caused a lot of psychological stress and trauma to those involved, and also significant financial cost. I think of Bill Leak. Now, Bill Leak, you may not like his cartoons. You may not like your cartoons, and that's fine. I find him funny. I've found some of his cartoons very risque and pushing the boundaries, but that's who he is. That's who he is. But I do want to acknowledge that after the Je suis Charlie attacks in January of 2015, he had the courage to do a cartoon where he illustrated the Prophet Muhammad. Now, whatever you may think of that, he showed significant courage, and he had to relocate his home because of death threats given to him or sent to him on the internet. And so I find it rather ironic that in a free society, when he published a cartoon, and whatever you might think of that cartoon, he was then pursued under 18C for that cartoon. So what the terrorists couldn't achieve themselves, in a free society, we had a mechanism of government that went after him and pursued him for another cartoon of his, which I think is just unacceptable. So to the report itself, recommendation 1. I approve recommendation 1.1, which is addressing racism in Australian society. Absolutely we need to address racism. We need to address racism in all those mediating institutions that I just mentioned. Recommendation 2, recognising the profound impacts of serious forms of racism, the committee recommends that leaders of the Australian community and politicians exercise their freedom of speech to identify and condemn racially hateful and discriminatory speech where it occurs in public. Affirm that. Absolutely. And in fact, I copped a flogging on Facebook a couple of weeks ago after Larry Pickering's comments at the Q Society, where I condemned his remarks. I condemned them for what he said about gay people, and I condemned him for what he said about Islamic State and what they're doing, the barbarous acts they're doing in Iraq and Syria. And, you know, a lot of people said I overstepped the mark. And great, I'm happy for that. I enjoyed the flogging in a sense because, again, it was another healthy indicator that democracy is alive and well and everyone can have their point of view. Now we get to recommendation 3. And I go specifically to C, where it says removing the words offend, insult and humiliate from section 18C and replacing them with harass. I think we need to do that. My colleague Senator James Patterson last night said that we have a unique opportunity, this Parliament, a pathway where we have consensus around some of these recommendations, and I recognise that this Parliament is a tough one. It's rather austere from a legislative point of view, and so it's difficult to get legislation through. But I think we can all agree on the evidence that the QUT case, the Bill Leak case and others are a step too far. We absolutely need to reform it. Politics is the art of the possible. I'd rather not have 18C altogether, but I know that's not going to be achieved. But I do think we need to make changes. We need to make the threshold much higher to avoid the vexatious litigation which we've seen. Now, ultimately, as I said, I'm a Liberal, so I'm going to err on the side of individual liberty. And I hope that my fellow Australians are committed to a united country that isn't divisive, that can preserve freedom and also ensure that the responsibilities of individual citizens are enforced and met But this 18C, it has a chilling effect and we need reform, and that's why I endorse it.